favorite text, Psalm 8. Hear these words. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and all the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. The Hebrew word for dominion is mashal. But mashal also has a homonym, a word that sounds the same but has a different meaning in the Hebrew text. And that word means wisdom, insight. That the word mashal has more than one meaning should give us pause this morning to what the biblical author might be suggesting when he or she writes that God has granted us dominion over the earth. I think sometimes we in our postmodern sensibilities, when we hear that word dominion, we tend to think of ruling over or in terms of winning and losing. To dominate another team is to win by a significant amount, not what the Chiefs did last night. To dominate another person is not just to hold power over that person, but to put that person in his or her place. This meaning of the word dominate is not what the biblical author had in mind when they wrote those beautiful lines. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. I get the sense that it is true that the author did believe that humankind was made in the imago Dei, or the image of God. You get the sense that the author also had in mind that humanity had been given a certain amount of responsibility to care for God's creation. The author marveled at this responsibility. You get this sense as they write the lines, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals that you care for them. The author seems to be dumbfounded, awestruck at the immensity and sheer awesomeness of the responsibility given to humankind by God. With all this in mind, it should be easy for us as postmodern readers and interpreters of Scripture to see that humanity has not been called to subjugate, to put under our rule the creatures of the glen and dale, sky and sea, or even the majestic mountains and forests. We are not called to bend them to our will, but to care for, to nurture, to steward, not to abuse or twist in some form or fashion so that we might profit off the backs of other living creatures. This week is our second week in our sermon series called Faith and Science. We are exploring the relationship between what it is that we believe theologically about God and what we also understand about science and what it can teach us. For some, there has been a growing divide between the two. Science, in the eyes of some, should be viewed with skepticism, and vice versa. Faith, in the eyes of some, should be viewed with skepticism at arm's length. And I would argue that when one abuses what we can gain from either, that particular viewpoint should be viewed with skepticism. But when we are open to learn from one another and to engage with one another with care and respect, we can learn some incredible things. I am not a scientist. My realm, my lane is theological studies. I spend my time reflecting on sacred texts, reading commentaries, studying theology and all kinds of fascinating things. Exactly. I am not, oh, you're good. You please don't, yeah, you're good. It is not my world, but I love the things that science can teach us. I love the things that we can learn from scientists who do incredible, hard, challenging research and work to help us learn more about our bodies, about the world, about our universe and those beyond. I love the advances made in quantum physics and medical studies, although I understand next to nothing about either field. But I value the knowledge that we have gained from those studies. And I've been especially paying more and more attention to the things that science has taught us about our environment and the cause of pollution in that environment. Last November, I was invited to attend the Parliament of the World's Religions in Toronto, Canada. It's a gathering of religious leaders and academics where we come together and talk about all the things that we are facing across the globe as people of faith and what our role might be to work towards healing and reconciliation and tackling some of those issues. At the forefront of that gathering was the report that had just come out from the UN about the impending danger of climate crisis by the year 2040. Only 20 years from now, folks, if you are counting. Religious leaders were concerned. Practitioners of faith were worried about the information they were receiving, not just from a scientific perspective, but a theological one. What was our faith saying about how we were to treat this common home we share? I read an article recently by Erica Evans who writes, "Some religious people question scientific evidence that humans are to blame because they believe these climate changes are God's will and part of a natural cycle. Others are driven to protect the planet by a belief that God created the earth and gave humans a sacred responsibility to care for it." At the Parliament of World Religions, I attended a seminar led by one of my theological heroes, who, if I'm entirely honest with you, I wasn't sure was still around anymore. Dr. John Cobb is an eminent scholar, a leader in process theology, but he is an academic of the first order, studies many things. And one of the things he had been studying recently is the relationship between economics and the environment. And he said something really interesting I'd never considered before. Some of you may or may not know, but I do have my MBA. I know something of the business world. And he said GDP, gross domestic production, a tool which we think measures the success of an economic system, doesn't really measure success at all. The only thing it measures is how quickly we are using up the Earth's natural resources to make products for us to buy. In other words, our economic practices are driving the devastation of our environment. I think this is not new information for many of you. He went on to say that people who feel the effects of climate change the most are the poor and the disenfranchised of our world. And here's where I think we need to pause. Science may be able to give us the tools to study and to measure the impact of human influence on the environment. But I believe as a person of faith that theology and what we understand about God can directly affect changes within our spirit and can directly affect the actions we take in the community and world around us. One of our most fundamental beliefs as Christians is that we have been called to protect the poor, the disenfranchised, those who have been pushed to the margins. Think of all the stories from the Bible that you love, folks. The Good Samaritan. The list could go on and on. All those stories where Jesus reached out to those who were cast out because of an illness or because of some physical ability that they could not have or did not have. Jesus reached out to them to protect them, to care for them, to bring them back into the community. Those are the people we're talking about, who are affected most by the environmental devastation that we, as a nation, we, as a species, have caused in our world. Theology, faith, leads us to act, calls us to respond, to protect the incredible home and world that we share, which, according to the poet, is our tremendous responsibility. I think too many times we cling to an idea that what we have been given by God is permission to do whatever we want with the resources at our disposal. And that is one interpretation I have heard in sermons in the past. I just happen to believe it's wrong. We have been called to be wise with our responsibility, wise with our caretaking of the earth, of our neighbor, and our responsibility to God. As people of faith, I don't believe we can ignore the lessons that science can teach us. I don't believe there is a war between faith and science. And I would also put forth that any faith perspective that argues there is this sort of divide, this sort of fight going on between science and faith walks a dangerous line. A line meant to divide and ignore what can be learned about the world around us. Faith and science are not enemies. They can and should be friends. They are seeking answers to different questions, of course. But whenever people of faith place people of science at odds with one another, we create a false dichotomy. We embrace that other version of the word to dominate, meaning one must be a winner and one must be a loser, when that is not what we are called to be and do as people of faith. In his encyclical, a letter written by Pope Francis entitled "Praise Be to You on Care for Our Common Home," he writes, "A very solid scientific consensus indicates that we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. In recent decades, this warming has been accompanied by constant rise in sea level, and it would appear by an increased number of extreme weather events, even if a scientifically determinable cause cannot be assigned to each particular phenomenon. Humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it." Pope Francis, by the way, received his master's in chemistry, and then he became the Pope. Faith and science can be friends. To have a faith in God is not to abandon reason or science or the lessons we can learn from one another. Instead, I would argue, our faith calls us to pursue a connection a relationship with the source of all being, of all life, the divine spark of life that exists throughout the entire universe, namely God. And to develop a trust in a connection between you and me and our neighbors and all living things. And it is that connection, that pull towards one another, that relationship that can help us as we begin to heal the world. My Jewish friends have a saying called tikkun olam, healing the world. How do we do it? What is our faithful response as Christians? Should we bury our heads in the sand and ignore the wisdom that science can help provide? Shall we throw our hands up and say it is too late? Or is it possible to work together, to work with our neighbors, to work with those people in power that can affect the change that needs to happen to help repair and heal the world, especially for those whose power has been taken away? Friends, I believe our poet this morning challenges us, challenges our faith, challenges the way we are called to act and respond to the world around us. I think our poet this morning, when they use that word dominate, is suggesting that we wisely steward, we wisely care for, we consider our actions and weigh them responsibly, to conserve, to reuse and recycle, to use less water, less electricity, less fossil fuels and other non-renewable energy sources, so that our world continues to be a common home for generations long after we are gone. We must look beyond our own. It is our sacred responsibility to do so. And we have a responsibility to act as people of faith, to change, to care, to prove to future generations that we weren't just in it for our own gain and profit, but for the benefit of subsequent generations. That we were wise caretakers and stewards of the gift of this earth. This is our call, our responsibility. This is how faith will shape our actions, which will last and ensure the safety and life of those who will share our common home in the future. What can science teach us? What can we do together to work towards healing the world? And what steps are we willing to take as Lee Summit Christian Church? Solar panels on the roof? Cleaner energy throughout our building? Reusing more? Reducing our waste? These are all things that we can do. These are all statements of faith we can put forward so that others will know that we take our sacred responsibility to care for this world, these neighbors, seriously. May God grant us strength and wisdom as we learn together how to care for God's beautiful creation. May God grant us hope as we work together to heal the world. And may God grant us courage to own up to our shared responsibility and in faithful response, commit to the hard and faithful work ahead. We are not alone in this work. We have each other. We have God. Amen.